Thanks for listening to this archive of Teaching American History's Saturday webinar for Saturday, October 2nd, 2021. This is the third in our American Presidency webinar series for fall of 2021, and today's focus was presidential powers, in particular war powers, emergency powers, and foreign policy powers, those areas where the president has traditionally had the most flexibility and leeway in exercising power. We were joined, as usual, by our moderator, Dr. Chris Burkett of Ashland University, Dr. Sarah Burns of the Rochester Institute of Technology, and Dr. Stephen Knott of the United States War College. You can learn more about these webinars and other programs and resources at tah.org. That is teachingamericanhistory.org. Thanks for listening.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another teachingamericanhistory.org Saturday webinar, sponsored by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. TAH.org is the leading online resource for the documents-based study of American history, government, and civics for teachers, students, and citizens. I'm Chris Burkett, teach political science and history at Ashland University, and I'm director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program for undergraduate students here at Ashland University. So this year for our Saturday webinars, we're drawing inspiration from two of our core documents collections published by Ashbrook, both of which are available at TAH.org. In the spring, we'll be discussing populists and progressives, but this fall our theme is the presidency, and we're drawing again from our American Presidency core documents collection. So if you happen to be joining us for the first time, the point of these webinars is to just bring together some thoughtful scholars, some great thinkers, people who have written and thought about this subject quite extensively, and to have a conversation about, in this case, the presidency. And I encourage all of you joining us today to participate in our conversation by submitting questions in the Q&A function. And as always, we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. In the next week, you'll receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. So today our topic is presidential war powers and foreign policy. And to help us think about this question, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Sarah Burns of Rochester Institute of Technology. Sarah teaches very regularly in our Master of Arts in American History and Government program and teaches courses on American political thought and a number of other subjects. So very happy to have you here this morning, Sarah. And also pleased to welcome Dr. Stephen Knott of the United States Naval War College. And I'd like to mention here that Dr. Knott is the editor of a brand new core documents volume on American foreign policy to 1899. And it is available as of today, I believe, in the TAH.org bookstore, both in hard copy and as a PDF. So congratulations on wrapping that up, Steve.
Thank you, Chris.
So again, I'm very glad both of you could join us this morning. Let me just start with a very broad question to get our minds into this topic of presidential war powers. So this is a pretty controversial topic for a lot of people, and scholars have been arguing. Presidential scholars have been arguing over what exactly the president's powers are when it comes to directing war and the use of the military and generally sort of guiding foreign policy. So I just want to start by asking both of you, why is this such an important question? Why is this such a controversial question? What the powers of the president are in foreign policy?
Thanks for that. I think part of the difficulty comes from the fact that the founders not only were diverse in their views, but also they didn't give us a lot of clarity on exactly what they mean when they say things like the power to declare war. So the traditional understanding is there was a moment when Madison was talking with people near the end of the Constitutional Convention, and they said, well, let's change make to declare so that the president has the power to respond to sudden attacks or repel sudden attacks. Okay, great. What does that mean? What level of response does it mean? And they are annoyingly very silent on exactly what they mean. On top of that, if you look at the early administrations, you can see very diverse answers from greats like Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. So we don't really know exactly what they said. And so then in the 70s, when people started really looking into the original intent, those kinds of questions, we didn't have a lot of definitive answers, which allowed for this broad this broad literature that I am a part of, where people just sort of go back and forth and say, no, the founder said this, no, the founder said that, and then try and figure out exactly, what we know and what we don't know. And I think because it's a very unsettled question, we continue to have that dialogue.
I would just add to what Sarah said, this ambiguous nature of where the war power lies. Obviously, elements of it in Article 1 with the legislative branch, elements of it in Article 2. And as Edward Corwin, the famous 20th century political scientist, political historian, I guess would perhaps be more accurate, noted, there was kind of an invitation to struggle in terms of which body would be directing both foreign policy writ large, but also responsible for war powers. And so you've got this ambiguity from the start, as Sarah mentioned, and you had two very conflicting views, at least two camps. Perhaps on the one hand, the sort of Washington Hamilton camp, and on the other side, Jefferson and Madison. And I'm sure we're going to get into this when we talk about Pacificus and Helvidius. But again, there's a kind of ambiguity, an invitation to struggle that's built into the system. And that's what makes this issue so contentious and so hard to kind of put your finger on. I think even perhaps by the end of our hour and 15-minute discussion here, there's going to be more questions than answers.
That's a great point. It is a big question, and we do have about an hour. So I would love to get what we can from the founders' sort of thinking or thought about foreign policy. But before we do that, can I just ask one follow-up question of both of you? Do you think that the question of the president's role in foreign policy has become more important in the 20th century than it was in the 18th and the early republic? And if so, if that's true, why do you think that's the case?
Very insightful, penetrating question there. I I say in an effort to buy myself a bit of time. Broadly speaking, I would say that the president was, prior to FDR, really viewed as someone who predominantly focused on foreign affairs, right? His domestic role was meaningfully limited to, the State of the Union and obviously consenting to or vetoing laws. But for the most part, this was supposed to be the realm of Congress. And it was only when we get to the Teddy Roosevelts and the Wilsons that we start seeing Congress allowing or consenting to have a little bit more of a role for the president. So it's certainly true that as America became significantly more involved internationally, which was happening around, again, TR, so turn of the 20th century, you see the president then having an oversized role because there was so much more to do. At the same time, I'll defer to Steve here if you would like to take over for my ramblings. I can't say. It's certainly true, I would say, that after you get nuclear weapons, the role of the president becomes dramatically outsized to the role of Congress. And that was essentially on consent of both branches. So I guess I would take it from that moment really onward. And maybe the moment when the Soviet Union gets the bomb as well, which is 1950. So maybe from that moment on, you could say, now we have a president who's got a world-saving or world-destroying role, and that puts a lot of pressure on someone's shoulders.
Yeah, that's a terrific answer, Sarah. And just to add to it, I do think that in the 20th into the 21st century, this question does become more vital for the reasons that Sarah just outlined. Particularly technological developments like nuclear weapons, like the ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. The fact that now the United States had lost its somewhat exceptional position of being geographically isolated from the conflicts of the old world. We had this great moat, the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, that separated us from the rest of the world. ICBMs, modern technological advances just wiped that out. And as Sarah suggested, that puts the president in a unique role. He's going to have, at best, 20 minutes to a half an hour to make a decision that might involve the deaths of millions. That alters things, and it's something we have to, I think, acknowledge. Plus, as Sarah suggested, beginning in the early 20th century, the United States begins slowly to assume the role of the world's policeman. That's kind of a pejorative term, but let's face it, right after the Second World War, this country, our country, is in a unique position. We had a gross national product in 1946 larger than the rest of the world combined. And we took it upon ourselves, somewhat hesitatingly, to become something of the world's policeman. And again, that tends to focus all the attention, all the sort of certainly media and public attention on the commander-in-chief, the President of the United States.
Yeah, thank you for those very thoughtful answers. And then maybe as a follow-up, there's a question from Adam. Adam asks, how does ambiguity of what war itself means play out in presidential and congressional powers over time, including questions of, what distinguishes a police action from a conflict and this and that. So sort of following up on the sort of more recent or contemporary way of thinking about foreign policy actions.
I mean, don't get me started, Adam. It's such a frustrating aspect of modern discussions of war, because it used to be very clear. Sorry, I'll try and get a little less exercise. So like up to World War II, we knew exactly what war was, right? It's a breaking of the normal peacetime relations between two countries. So when Japan attacks us, we call back our diplomats, they call back their diplomats, and we're at it, right? We have a totally different relationship to that country. And while there's still some kind of diplomatic correspondence, it is all done on a war footing. After that, we get into these UN actions and, what does that mean? And so like the Korean War, which was a war, right? It wasn't like we didn't have boots on the ground or any kind of like dumb ambiguity. I apologize. But the point is that like, we had a lot of people mobilized from the United States to Korea. And that was, by any measure of what we would call a war. But Truman kept calling it a police action. And he kept saying that he had to do it because, the honor of the UN, which was like a 3-year-old body or something at that point, it was necessitated his action. So he didn't really know what he was doing. The Russians didn't really know what they were doing. Everyone was just like mucking around in this poor country that only wanted to, anyway, sorry. Okay, so that's the police action thing. And then we get this continued ambiguity through the Cold War because of the fact that, for example, when we went into Vietnam, we didn't want to say we were at war with Vietnam because that would then trigger a hot war, potentially a hot conflict with the USSR. So in order to avoid that, we have this like nebulous, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is very kind of like, we're helping friends of ours in the area because they've asked us for help, which they didn't. But, we're here doing stuff, but we're not going to say exactly what we're doing or who we're helping or who we're fighting against. We're just, restoring the peace in some kind of way. And so this just kind of like launches us into all the problems that we had in the Cold War, in part because we were genuinely trying to avoid a hot conflict with Russia, which is good, right? I'll say like positive on that. We definitely didn't want everyone blowing up the world. But because we had sustained decades of this ambiguity of what a conflict was, what a war was, what it means when we're doing some kind of conflict, then we end up just perpetuating that. And it seems like Congress has never reasserted its muscles, its foreign policy muscles, to say, actually, you are now in a war and we do not like what you're doing. And so it all just gets messier, especially in the war on terror, because then, one more thing. Then in the war on terror, we're fighting just individuals, right? So how we don't have a return address where we can say, all right, send the cavalry over there. These are the bad guys, right? They're in that country. We're going to recall our diplomats from X country because terrorism is international by nature, right? It doesn't exist within borders. So that just makes it even harder to figure out how to say like, this is a war we're fighting against, for example, Japan versus, international terrorism, which is like all around us, right? So, sorry to be dramatic. All right, I'm done.
So to build on what Sarah said, I mean, one way to think of, and that was a terrific question, Adam. One way to think about the fact that defining war is so ambiguous is the fact that the United States has had 5 declared wars in its history, right? Well, I think the War of 1812, the war with Mexico under Polk, the Spanish-American War under McKinley, and the 2 world wars. But if you were to take account of the number of times that US forces have been involved in some sort of hostilities, it's well into the hundreds. And in fact, it's so difficult to define that there's not even a consensus on that number of how many times US force, does hostilities constitute an American officer being slapped by a British officer off the coast of Honduras? Is
Right.
that an act of hostilities? So it is a difficult term, I think, to get a handle on. I think it goes back to the start. Hamilton, right from the start, seems to think that Congress's power to declare war, while it's certainly important, it's not the be all and end all. In other words, there could be situations where the president would be allowed to use force short of a declaration of war. In other words, if we're attacked, he doesn't have to wait, in Hamilton's view. The hostilities begin the minute we are attacked, and the president, as commander-in-chief, can respond. So it is, again, it's another one of these scenarios that's very tough to get a kind of ironclad definition of. And that makes this an incredibly complicated issue.
Yeah, great point. So what do you measure, right? I mean, is it the number of troops? Is it the duration? I mean, is it the extent of domestic mobilization? I mean, all of these are factors. And Joe mentions, for example, the Barbary Wars and the Indian War. We call them wars, but there was no official declaration, of course, from Congress for either of those.
Right. Right.
So I thought that was Casey. Casey was reading my mind. I think there's a follow-up question. Casey writes that the war powers of Congress in Article 1 imply that the president cannot engage in a large-scale conflict without authorization or approval from Congress. Has that line been blurred due to technological developments of the 20th century? And I think we partly answered that, right? Or we've addressed that. But I was thinking in relation to this question, you make these different distinctions between sort of full-blown declared war and then undeclared war and then police actions and conflicts and smaller scale operations, hostilities. Does the president have, again, this is maybe too big of a question, is there more leeway or discretion on the part of the president to do certain things? In other words, does the president have more powers to do, depending on sort of the nature of the hostilities, despite what Article 1 says?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, this goes into like the politics of war powers. Here, I'll plug my book. So Steve has too many books to plug.
There you go.
But I can plug my one book.
It's a great book, by the way. Terrific book.
It is. It's great.
So I think that there was a broad consensus, again, between the branches among Americans, that an American president can, as Jefferson did, send the Navy to defend American property and people abroad. And, that was fine, right? Similarly, there were some actions against Mexican border towns and Mexican port cities because they were kind of messing with, again, US commerce or US people. And so again, no one had a problem with the president kind of saying, I'm going to go and deal with this, right? It's a small, discrete action, typically, right? The Barbary Wars were a little bit more broad, but that's a huge topic. So I won't go too far into that. And similarly, the Indian Wars seems more like an effort on the part of the president to do what European empires or European emperors have been doing forever, which is, we have this big military now after the Civil War, so why not keep using it to do something, right? Instead of drawing it down. So that, I think, explains some of the Indian Wars. And so I think then, sorry to go back. So I think what happened is you have a change in what the consensus allows for. And what I mean by that is that it used to be that presidents had to go to Congress for big, large-scale operations because they didn't have the money and they didn't have the military to do those things without Congress actually giving them literal checks to say, go get the military that we need to fight the Japanese, fight the Germans. But after we have this huge standing military, it becomes a lot easier for presidents to just say, I kind of want to move like 100,000 troops into Saudi Arabia, which President H.W. Bush did. And Congress wasn't exactly powerless to stop him, but essentially when he went to them to get an authorization for it, it was a fait accompli, right? There was already 100,000 people, maybe 200,000, I can't remember now. So once you have that kind of might in the hands of presidents, it makes it awfully hard for Congress to say, I'm sorry, Mr. President, you can't move all these troops around, you can't do these things. And they would have to, let's say in the case of the 1991 war, they would have had to stop funding to our boys and girls fighting abroad, right? They would have looked horrible. So the power of the purse, or the capacity of Congress to stop the president once you have this huge standing army, is next to nothing, right?
Yeah, I would add to that, building on what Sarah said, the president is uniquely situated to take advantage of these kinds of scenarios, whether it's the first Gulf War or even going all the way back to Jefferson and the Barbary Wars. Jefferson tried to package that exercise of American power as a strictly defensive one. The United States Navy was going into the Mediterranean to protect American ships there, to protect American commerce, and our naval ships would only respond if attacked. So they were going to act in a very defensive manner. This is Jefferson's way of trying to appear to be sort of obedient to the Constitution and deferring to Congress's powers in Article 1. The fact is, however, and this is where my Hamiltonianism might be showing itself, Jefferson had given somewhat secret orders to the Navy to be extremely offensive, to go on the offense, not to wait to be attacked. But that version of events is not the one that was presented to Congress. And so the president has this power to, and I'm not, by the way, necessarily endorsing this, but to manipulate the kinds of information that is given to Congress, and it puts Congress in a passive, deferential position. And as Sarah indicated, in some ways, the tools that Congress has at its disposal, if they wish to push back, politically speaking, it's nightmarish for Congress. The idea of cutting off the men and women in the field is a political scenario that almost all member of Congress they're going to want to avoid, whether it's in 1801 or 2021. So in my view, the president has in some ways all the cards and is uniquely situated to, if he so chooses, eventually she so chooses, to manipulate these situations and put Congress very much in a passive role.
Yeah, those are great points. So I don't know if I hesitate to do this because no, I'm not trying to say the Constitution doesn't matter, because it does. But as you both have pointed out, the Constitution is very open to interpretation of what these powers are. So when we're asking what are the powers of the president in foreign policy, the answer kind of depends on all the factors perhaps that you're raising. So the nature of the hostility, maybe the inclination of the person holding the office, right? There have been presidents that have really wanted to take the reins, and there have been others who were more wanted for various reasons to be more deferential to Congress. And then Congress, what's the attitude of Congress? Mm-hmm. There are Congresses that want to assert itself a little bit more, but then there are those that, Congresses that can't do that for the reasons that you've mentioned. So I'm starting to really get a sense here of why this is such a messy, complicated question, let alone what the Constitution actually means, right? So,
well, and even look at just, we have Hamilton and Madison, who a few years before were, on essentially the same page, right, in writing the Federalist Papers together. And then as soon as Washington declares neutrality, they have diametrically opposed understandings about what this action is, where Hamilton, as specific as is saying, it's fine. He's just saying we're neutral. It's not a big deal, guys. And Madison is running around with his hair on fire saying it's a huge deal. This is a big, big problem. He is absolutely usurping congressional powers. So, these two founders that are like respectable and genuinely thoughtful about what the Constitution means, and were there writing it, right, could fundamentally disagree so quickly after the implementation of the Constitution gives us already a sense of how complicated it is, right?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. Let me just add, I would mention that American presidents, and this is in line with what I was trying to say earlier, this tendency to couch their actions in a defensive mode. Jefferson's going to do it with the Barbary pirates in 1801. James K. Polk is going to do it with his war with Mexico. He's going to accuse Mexico of starting the war by attacking American troops on American soil. And of course, this is going to infuriate Abraham Lincoln, the so-called spot resolutions. Where did this conflict actually take place? And I don't think it's a stretch to say that the Polk administration was not forthcoming. It was a deceptive account of how that war began. But again, it fits with this presidential tradition of trying to couch their actions as a defensive response. You see it with Lyndon Johnson's Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which is suspect at best. You see it with George H.W. Bush when we invade Panama around Christmas 1989. The pretext for that was that an American soldier had been killed by Noriega's troops in the Canal Zone. You see it with Grenada in '83 with President Reagan. The medical students on the island of Grenada were threatened, the American medical students. And the list goes on and on and on. And a lot of times these accounts, to be blunt, are not particularly credible. So again, I would argue that the president, and I'm not necessarily endorsing this, but historical practice seems to me has shown that the president has all sorts of advantages when it comes to exercising the use of force.
Yeah, those are wonderful points. Sorry, Sarah.
A little bit sorry there, because Congress has to know this, right? Congress has to know that presidents have this first mover capacity and the capacity to kind of couch things in a certain way. So to a certain meaningful extent, we should put a lot of responsibility on Congress for not doing their job, right? Like they are the ones who are getting this information. And if they just say like, oh, of course, Mr. President, like we absolutely are going to just do exactly what you say. This is like your students who come into class and they're like, oh, my uncle passed away. And then the next week, like their grandparents passed away. You're kind of like, did all those people die? Like, is this actually happening? So lacking credulity is something that we should expect from Congress. And unfortunately, we don't see that very often. Right?
Yeah, great point, Sarah. And of course, presidents, politically speaking, as you mentioned earlier, seem to be almost at the peak of their powers whenever they are exercising the use of force and whenever our men and women are in the field. It takes a real act of courage for a member of Congress to stand up to the commander-in-chief when our troops are in peril. And it takes a particular act of courage when the president is of your own party. And again, there is this tendency to fall into line, particularly when your guy is, or your woman is in the White House. When you're in the opposition, it's a little easier to show some acts of courage, but even there, it's a tough one when it comes to uses of force.
Yeah, great point. So by the way, this is really great. I just wanted to mention that Robert had submitted a question asking if TAH had something like a list describing the 5 wars and the distinction between undeclared wars, police action. And again, I just want to mention Sarah's book. I know you do a great job. Please hold it up again. Yeah, I really recommend this. And I suspect again that though there's not really a list in the collection, Steve, that just came out that you edited, you'll start to get a sense by looking at the documents that you included of how we start to make some of these distinctions. So
that is correct, Chris. I went to some length to try to deal with that. And let me just say, regarding Sarah's book, The Politics of War Powers, I had the privilege of reviewing that book when Sarah first submitted it to the University Press of Kansas. Academic Press send these things out to external reviewers. You can remain anonymous if you wish. I chose not to remain anonymous because, in all honesty, this is a rare book when it comes to war powers, because Sarah not only understands the sort of philosophical debates going back to Locke, and especially in Sarah's case to Montesquieu, but she also understands American history. And it's a real incredible mix of both practice and political philosophy, if you will. So I highly recommend it. And by the way, I'm not getting paid for this endorsement.
Oh, I was going to say checks in the mail, but yes. Thank you, Steve. That's very flattering. Very nice to hear. So yeah, I spend so much time at home just getting rejection letter after rejection letter. So it's nice to occasionally know that something I've written is not as bad as I thought it was.
Great book.
So I hope that helps some of the people joining us here who are asking for good sources on these things. So great. So so the stakes have gone up in terms of foreign policy and the nature of threats and things in the 20th century. We talked about that earlier. And again, I don't want to overdo this, right? I think the stakes have gone up in terms of the nature of threats and the immediacy of threats and developments in technology. So maybe foreign policy concerns are a much more pressing nature than they were in the founding era. Again, I don't want to overdo that too much, but that didn't stop them in the founding era from arguing as though these were, maybe some of the most fundamental issues, this question of the powers of the president in relation to Congress when it comes to foreign policy. And maybe the reason that they argued so passionately about this, and again, you see this in the Helvidius Pacificus or Pacificus Helvidius debates, is precisely because, as you both said at the beginning, the constitutional, if you look at the Constitution itself, it's quite vague. If you ask the delegates or ask, the framers, I know that a lot of the debates were not, public at the time in the early republic, but they themselves didn't spend a lot of time discussing these things. So if we're going to figure out what the role of the president in relation to Congress is in foreign policy, we've got to kind of work these things out in practice, right? So the first great test, I think, of this question comes with the proclamation of neutrality. And this causes a pretty big uproar, right? I mean, among the general public, there are people who are saying this is a usurpation of executive power on the one hand, and there are others who are saying, no, this is sensible policy because we're trying to stay out of war. So can you just sort of walk us through or help us understand why this was such a big issue in 1793, and why did Pacificus or Hamilton respond the way he did, and what was Madison thinking in his response? So what do you think? Can you just help us get into this because I think this really does sort of set the tone for many future debates with regard to presidential powers in foreign policy. So what was going on here?
Yeah, it's a very complicated thing. So I think I'll start with the 1778 treaty with France. I think it was 1778.
Yeah.
Do you happen to know it was 1778?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we had a previous treaty with France, and as many of you probably know, the French were instrumental, right, in helping Americans beat the British. Were it not for the French, I think it's fairly clear that we probably wouldn't have won against the British, but that's debatable for some people. So we have this treaty saying that we're going to mutually defend each other. Great, right? And so America's like all into this in 1778 because we're like, yes, please help us. Like we need your help so badly. 1793 rolls around. France has, killed a king, become a republic, and now they're saying to us, we need your help here in the West Indies against the British. And Washington at this point has like no military, no navy really to speak of, no money even to really put anything together, and then a risk of fighting against the greatest naval force that the world had ever known. So the Washington administration, just from like necessity's point, had to sort of really think seriously about whether or not to honor this treaty with France and the implications for the United States at this very vulnerable state of its existence. And so everyone in Washington's administration was agreed, even Jefferson, right? Jefferson was the Secretary of State at the time. So even Jefferson didn't say word one, and this has always bugged me. I've never figured out exactly what Jefferson was doing, but Jefferson then writes to Madison and says, you have to be the one to say something against Hamilton because I'm in the administration, I can't do it, right? And so Madison, who was also in the legislature at the time, was then the one tasked with saying why Hamilton was wrong. So you also see here, Hamilton's presenting an executive view, let's say, of executive powers, Madison's presenting a more sympathetic towards the legislature view of executive powers. And that's part of why you see this dialogue, is because they're coming from literally different camps, right? Hamilton wants the powers of the presidency to be as big as possible to contain constitutionally these actions. Madison, conversely, wants to show that the legislature actually has a lot of claims to certain foreign policy powers, and the president is encroaching on those powers, right? And he has a stake in that, right? And so this is the ambition counteracting ambition, and the interest of the man following the interest of the place, or the whatever the rest of that is. I got that wrong. But this is a really important element of it too, is that like they were arguing from their own individual camps, right? So it's not just that like one has the right interpretation and the other one has the wrong interpretation. It's, if you're an executive officer, you have a certain view about the size and scope of the executive power. If you're a legislative officer, you want to try and shrink that as much as possible and enlarge the legislator control over wars.
Yeah, excellent answer, Sarah. And I would add to it, not only was, I think, Hamilton coming from the sort of executive perspective and Madison from the legislative. And by the way, I think, Sarah, the reason why Jefferson asks Madison to take up his pen and shred Hamilton, that's typical Jefferson. He hated personal confrontation, and he always turned to his deputies. I hate to refer to Madison as a deputy, but by 1793, he pretty much is. That's just classic Jefferson. You see that throughout his service in the Washington administration, turning to others to, in a sense, carry the battle in the public arena. But the more important point I wanted to make after getting my shot in at Jefferson and Madison was
that's fine by me. We're on the same page here. Yeah.
Was that one thing I think it'd be important for your teachers for the teachers listening in to understand. Hamilton and Washington come from the perspective of having fought the American Revolution. And they realized just how close this revolution came to not succeeding. Not only did Washington have to, in a sense, battle the British throughout the entirety of the American Revolution, he had to battle the Confederation Congress that was constantly not delivering the supplies, the manpower, the financing he needed to conduct the war. It was an endless battle over delays, over congressional leaks of information, over congressional foot drag. So Washington and Hamilton emerged from that war, I think, convinced that if this country is going to prevail, we won the war, but we're in danger of losing the peace because the articles are not strong enough. We need a presidency that has some formidable, or as Hamilton would say, energetic powers, particularly in the war powers, or today maybe we'd call it the national security arena. So these two men who fought in this war, I think, are determined to infuse into this new, somewhat untried, unparalleled executive office some energy. And so it's I think a broader, on Hamilton and Washington's part, a broader attempt to lay down a marker for future generations where the presidency is going to take the lead on these types of matters. And again, I'm not necessarily saying that was the wise path to take, but it's definitely the path that Hamilton and Washington took, partly as a result of their wartime experience and realizing just how close we came to losing it all.
Very interesting. I think that's a great point. What strikes me is, again, I'm gonna jump in here, and I don't know if I'm going to defend Madison, but I'll try to present Madison's point of view a little bit.
Go ahead, Chris.
But I'm surprised.
Madison a problem with it's Jefferson. Yeah.
Well, again, not that I necessarily agree or disagree with it, but I'm surprised though, by the way, that because Madison had been in Congress through many of the Confederation Congress during many of the most critical years of the war.
Yeah.
And Madison was one of the I think he was one of the members of Congress who was very aware of the problems that Washington and Hamilton were facing in terms of not getting the supply. So Madison was aware of those problems, but here he is in 1793, for some reason, not thinking this is any longer going to be an issue, right? So kind of
Chris,
surprised by that. Go ahead. Yeah, please.
I honestly think, and again, I'll tell your audience just up front. I mean, I'm somewhat in the Hamiltonian camp, needless to say, but
That's okay.
look, Madison by this point in 17, both Jefferson and Madison have become convinced that Alexander Hamilton is interpreting the Constitution in such a way that is dangerous.
Right.
He's sort of ignoring the guideposts or the limitations on executive power and arguably even on the power of the federal government writ large. So by 1793, Madison has evolved. He's no longer a co-author of the Federalist Papers with Alexander Hamilton. He's no longer in, for lack of a better term, that nationalist or centralizing camp. He's very much become a devotee of Thomas Jefferson's view that Hamilton is a danger. And unfortunately, President Washington, in their view, is kind of old, even though he's probably around 63 or so, which I find somewhat disturbing to be, considered out of it.
Different time, yeah.
But by 1793, Chris, this is not the James Madison of 1787, 1788. He's really become convinced that Hamilton is up to no good.
Yeah, I think again, I think that's right, and I think he's, and again, I'm not trying to provoke either of you by saying this, but I think he's also convinced that Hamilton really is a monarchist of sorts.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And Madison wrote, I think it's shortly after this, a newspaper editorial. I think the title was Universal Peace or something along those lines. And Madison's point in that editorial was that republics are more likely or less likely than monarchies to engage or initiate unjust wars. So I do think that's also sort of weighing in the back.
Sure.
Don't get me wrong, I am not saying Hamilton was a monarchist, but I think Madison really does come to believe that.
No question. Yeah.
And now Hamilton does say in his defense, writing as Pacificus, some things that really do seem to, irk Jefferson and Madison. I often wonder if it's not so much Washington's proclamation that is a big problem, but Hamilton's response and attempt to justify and define executive powers that really sets them off in some ways. So can we talk about what Hamilton says executive power is with regard to foreign policy?
Yeah, I think that he was just, in my opinion anyway, setting the guardrails, like I said, a little bit wider than maybe is strictly necessary, right? Because all he's saying is the president has the power to, one, interpret treaties, which again, I don't think is, I call it plain reading the constitutional text. If you look at the text, right, you obviously have advise and consent with the Senate. So you should be consulting with them on the creation of the treaty. But once the treaty is created, I don't go all the way to the opinion in Curtis Wright where they say the president is the sole organ of foreign policy. And you're like, that's not right. That's a little too broad. Because obviously you have all these powers that are vested in Congress. So I think Hamilton is presenting a scope of power that is a legitimate understanding of the constitutional text, but it is a broader understanding about what the president can do in terms of interpreting laws, right? Because a treaty is a law between two countries or several countries. And I think Madison has some legitimacy there in saying, well, is treaty making, executive by nature, or is it legislative by nature? Because it's making a law, right? And so is this an executive power, the treaty making power that we put a little bit of into the legislature, which is Hamilton's point? Or is Madison right that because it's legislating, right, it's the creation, deliberation about, and then passing of laws, is it actually legislative by nature? And we just put some of that power into the hands of the executive to execute, right, to administrate the actual carrying out of the laws. Those are, again, like I said, entirely legitimate constitutional interpretations, but dramatically opposed to each other.
I think Sarah really put her finger on the sort of core of the constitutional dispute between Hamilton and Madison, or between Pacificus and Helvidius. And I would add, Chris, one thing that might help the listeners today is, so you've got this kind of constitutional interpretation debate going on, no question. But what's also hovering in the midst of all this, perhaps of equal importance, is American foreign policy towards this revolutionary government in France. So again, for the teachers out there, there's a constitutional debate. Who gets to sort of set this policy vis-a-vis the United States and France, and the United States and the monarchical powers of Europe? And there's a policy dispute. Should American foreign policy tilt in the direction of favoring the French, or should it tilt perhaps more in a direction of favoring Great Britain and some of the other monarchical powers? And of course, that's just incredibly contentious, because in the view of the Jeffersonians, and Sarah touched on this earlier, we have something of an obligation, arguably a moral obligation, to rally to the defense of our French brethren, who arguably helped us win our revolution. And I think both Jefferson and Madison were put off to some extent by the Washington-Hamilton decision to sort of stay out of it, which in their view was tantamount to tilting towards Great Britain. Now, from the perspective of Hamilton, for the United States in 1793, even to slightly tilt in the direction of supporting the French was not in our national interest. And so arguably Hamilton is the founder of the American School of Foreign Policy Realism. You know, we may wish the French well, we may not have a lot of love for monarchy, but for God's sakes, Great Britain is our largest trading partner. They've got the largest navy in the world. It would be suicide for our young nation, which is barely getting on its feet, to tilt its policy in a pro-French direction. So please keep all of that in mind as we're talking about the constitutional debate over who gets to set American policy at this point.
I do wonder, do either of you happen to know, I mean, Jefferson's opinions on the French Revolution are fairly, insane and straightforward, right? It's just, he's just saying like, they should all just blow, like.
What do you really think about them, Sarah?
I was reading a quote recently that said something, it was from a letter he wrote. I won't go it quickly, but he said something like, if there is, an Adam and Eve left on Earth to populate with liberty, everything will be fine. And you're kind of like, dude, that's not okay. So I wondered if either of you happen to know if Madison had a similarly robust support for the French, or whether he, as a more moderate, thoughtful creature, was kind of like, I mean, they're going a little too extreme here, right? I don't know. Do either of you happen to know?
So I wish, generally speaking, Madison would act as kind of a moderating influence on Jefferson's craziness. And the letter you're referring to, Sarah, is the one that Jefferson writes to William Short, who is an American chargé d'affaires in Paris, who writes and says, look, you would not believe the bloodletting that's going on in the streets of Paris. Hundreds, thousands are being killed. This revolution has turned in on itself. And Jefferson writes back and says he's very disappointed. He doesn't want to hear this. And in fact, if the French Revolution ends up killing every man and every woman, save one apiece from each gender, in order to keep the species alive, so be it. In a sense, that's the price one has to pay for overturning the old world order. I mean, it's a remarkable letter. But your question, Madison, in this case, from everything I've seen, it seems to share some of the revolutionary fervor that his fellow Virginians shared. I'll just give you one example. When the news comes that the royal family has been, members of the royal family have been guillotined and aristocrats by the score have been executed, Madison's response is that was, it's okay. That's what one should do to criminals. So in this case, and it shows you just how polarizing this issue was. In this case, I find, unfortunately, Madison not serving as a kind of moderating brake on Jefferson's revolutionary zealotry.
I think that's a fair answer. So, and I would also just add on top of that, Madison, maybe he was not as sort of zealous in his republicanism as Jefferson, but he had a deep-seated hatred of monarchy and monarchies and the British. That really lasted his entire life. So, no evil was. You couldn't heap enough evil on monarchies and monarchies from Madison's perspective. So.
Chris, could I jump? I'm sorry. Could I just make a quick point? Again, going on down this line, a couple years after, 2 years after this deeply divisive debate over the neutrality proclamation and Pacificus Helvetius, you get an even more divisive, if that's possible, debate over the Jay Treaty, which the folks didn't read for today. But, you know, Jefferson becomes convinced by 1795 that George Washington has also thrown in his lot with Great Britain. And that's when he writes his famous letter to Philip Massai, a former friend of his from Virginia, who's now living in Europe, in which he basically accuses George Washington of becoming, pardon the expression, a whore for Great Britain. So do not, none of the teachers listed, do not underestimate just how divisive this foreign policy, this war powers question was. You know, by 1795, you've got Jefferson believing that George Washington has become something of a British agent. It's remarkable.
That's a great point. So again, you mentioned earlier, full disclosure, you're sort of, you know, like Hamilton. I have great respect for Madison, but I think on this foreign policy question, I mean, Jefferson for sure, but on the foreign policy issue that we're dealing with, including the Jay Treaty, Madison is, I mean, I almost want to say not in his right mind on this issue. But Hamilton just makes so many good arguments, like with regard to not only the necessity of Washington issuing the proclamation, the constitutionality of it, as you were saying, Steve, the prudence of it, and also the justice of it, right? As you were pointing out, the French Revolution is running rampant. And Hamilton makes the argument that we have to ask ourselves as a country, do we really want to be associated, really, you know, allied with a country that is violating every law of nations, right? Every rule of international relations in its attempt to overthrow monarchies and, and they're the ones, by the way, who started it. They issued the first declarations of war. So just on your point, Steve, this is a many faceted issue. So yeah.
I will say a little bit, I've just been looking into this literally this week. And there's some question as to whether or not, because the Prussians actually were on the French border, kind of trying to decide, like, should we take advantage of this chaos that's going on in France? Should we help Marie Antoinette? You can make a case. So I'm not going to, you know, put myself down on one side or the other because I'm still looking into it. But you can make a case that the French, you know, decided to declare war because these guys were already, you know, showing them their teeth, right? And kind of saying, you know, we're going to do something. And so, like I said, I'm not on one side or the other. I'm still looking into this, but it's not clear to me that the French were as aggressive rather than being, you know, responding to the aggression from the Prussians. And the Prussians, you know, we all know, I guess, as we all know, the Prussians are a very aggressive lot. So it's a question still in my mind.
Yeah, fair enough. But so I think the takeaway, or one takeaway from this, is that these are all factors that play into Washington's decision as president to issue the proclamation pretty unilaterally, right? So it's an important decision on the part of Washington, but it's not a light decision. And it does, I think, what do you think? Let me ask you both. Does this help to sort of establish the idea that the president does and should have a pretty strong degree or large degree of discretion in foreign policy moving forward?
I think that it doesn't. I think there should be discretion for foreign policy decisions related to security. I think the president's role as the securer of the nation is clarified there, I think, effectively, right? And you do want a person, one singular person, being responsible for something like that level of security, where, you know, one of the things that the Washington administration was trying to avoid with this neutrality proclamation was American privateers going out and helping be it the French or the British, right? And then drawing us accidentally into the war. So the Washington administration was essentially saying, look, if any Americans do anything for anybody, we told them not to, right? And so I think when the stakes are that high, it's legitimate that a president could say, I'm going to take some actions that's a little bit controversial. And especially because if you look at Washington as a person, as a man, you know, he's often occasionally maybe often portrayed as like Hamilton's puppet. Really, part of the reason why he had big heavy hitters like Hamilton and Jefferson in his administration is so that he had both perspectives, right? Both views within his administration. So he could then take this moderating point and say, all right, if Jefferson and Hamilton can agree on what we should do, then it must be the right path for the country. And so I think that, to go back to your question, it does make sense that the president should have supremacy when it comes to security on that, when the stakes are that high. But I don't think that then translates into a broader, or it shouldn't translate, in my opinion, into a broader power over our foreign relations in general.
Chris, I would, your question, I think, was a very good one, because I would argue that George Washington's presidency, and this is hardly a revelation, but it was extremely significant, was important. He knew he was laying the groundwork. He and Hamilton knew, I would say, that they were setting a number of precedents that would likely be followed, for quite as long as perhaps even as long as the United States existed. So they were aware of that. And I think to a great extent, there are a series of decisions that take place during the 8 years of the Washington administration that do sort of put Congress in a more passive or reactive position. I've written about elsewhere, Washington asks in January 1790 for a Secret Service fund, which, since Sarah was plugging her book, I will plug this book with
also a very good book. Yeah, I love that book.
Provocative cover with Washington dressed up like a spy. But creating a Secret Service fund that exempt Washington or exempt the president from having to report how that Secret Service money or spying money was going to be spent. A remarkable concession made after the Republic exists for less than a year. Followed in 1793 by the Neutrality Proclamation, followed in 1795 by the Jay Treaty, where President Washington rebuffs a request from the House of Representatives led by James Madison to turn over all the relevant documents related to the Jay Treaty. So this Washington presidency, I think, sets a number of foreign policy and arguably war powers precedents that are going to last right up until 2021. And I'll just add, if you look at the war powers debate in Congress of 1973, the number of times people on both sides of the War Powers Act refer to the Neutrality Proclamation debate, it's incredible. The people looking for more restrictions on presidential power cite Madison's argument, and those opposed to it cite Hamilton's argument. So I do think some long-term precedents are set during the first 8 years of the Republic.
Those are, again, great points. So let me then, in our last, oh my goodness, this has just flown by, last 20 minutes maybe. For fast forward then. So let's go to Lincoln, because we recommended that students read Lincoln's message to Congress in special session. And we do have a number of questions on more contemporary things with regard to the presidential powers that I'd like to get to. So why then, why was what Lincoln did so controversial? He was blasted almost immediately for what he called the war powers. Was that, by the way, the first time that term had been used? Maybe that's an unfair question, but he says he has no choice but to exercise what he calls the war powers, right? So was he really acting so far out of line than sort of previous presidents had on occasion, things that they have done or precedents that have been established? I'm not asking my question very well. Was it really controversial?
I put Steve on the hot seat here because I feel like he has a better grasp of the Lincolnian qualities than I do.
Chris, I don't know the answer to the use of that term war power or war powers, so I'm going to have to take a pass on that one. But I would say what President Lincoln did in those first few months of his administration in 1861 were somewhat unprecedented. Certainly the suspension of habeas corpus, which he defends in this July 4th speech and elsewhere, were pretty remarkable exercises of presidential power, particularly for a president who cut his teeth as a Whig in the 1830s, protesting what Lincoln saw as a dangerous, assertive interpretation of presidential power on the part of Andrew Jackson. Now, having said that, Lincoln is confronted with an unparalleled threat to the existence of the Union. He recognizes that. I certainly recognize that. So as somebody who's taken a look at these issues over the years, I certainly think that Lincoln's actions were defensible. It was an incredibly unique situation. The country was literally falling apart. Lincoln could have, I suppose, tried to call Congress back into session. But the problem was, who do you seat? Who do you recognize as a legitimate representative, including in some of these border states that were still debating secession? Plus, to be blunt, I don't think the president necessarily wanted Congress back in town those first few months. It did give Lincoln some time, some autonomy to exert himself in a very expansive manner, suspending habeas corpus, I think calling up, 75,000 troops into service. The blockade, as Sarah just mentioned, which was an extraordinary act, normally would be considered an act of war. All of these things Lincoln does while Congress is out of session. The January 4th speech is an attempt to get their approval after the fact, which, by the way, the president does get retroactive approval from Congress. And then, of course, the Supreme Court will ultimately be asked to decide to a great extent on the constitutionality of all of this in the prize cases of 1863. And a divided court, I think 5-4, says that Lincoln was well within his powers to meet this incredibly unique emergency. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, Chris, but it's perhaps a start.
That is a nice sweeping, lots of great information there for a really big question in a limited amount of time that we have. So I appreciate that. So can I ask maybe your thoughts, and Sarah, of course, both of your thoughts on this. Is it important to keep the distinction in mind that Lincoln was, let me put it this way. So I think some future presidents have tried to, if not draw inspiration from, but sort of talk about their war powers in light of what Lincoln did and the way he talked about it. But Lincoln's not dealing, I mean, it's a war, but it's not like this is not foreign policy, right? I mean, Lincoln himself said, this is not a separate nation. He never recognized the seceded states as legitimately seceded. Is it important to keep in mind that what Lincoln is doing is exercising powers in times of rebellion, as opposed to exercising foreign policy powers? The reason, again, I ask this is I often wonder whether it's legitimate for some future presidents to speak in these sort of Lincolnian terms when it comes to justifying their foreign policy actions when Lincoln is dealing with rebellion. Does that distinction matter, or am I just?
I would like
grasping for something.
True. Yeah, like I would have liked it if future presidents, because it was FDR who started doing the damage in the destroyers for bases deal, where his attorney general, Robert Jackson, who later famously was like, these were bad ideas, but basically says, based on Lincoln's example, we can totally betray neutrality and help with the British. And Edward Corwin, that Steve mentioned earlier, said, nowhere in the Constitution does the president have this power. And you are making the example of Lincoln, where he was facing an existential, exigent crisis and saying that this is somehow similar, and the two are not parallel or even within the same ballpark of each other. So it's frustrating that we ended up having presidents who looked to the example of Lincoln and said, okay, in this extremely complicated and terrifying moment where everyone can agree, including Congress, right? When Congress came back into session, you should read the congressional record. Like, these guys are not in a hurry to do anything, right? To the point where Thaddeus Stevens says, hey, you guys, can we get him some money so that he can pay these troops? And they're like, we'll get to it. We wanted to honor, and then they just like go off on these speeches. And so everyone was in agreement that what Lincoln was doing was controversial, but necessitated and legitimate. Whereas when we get to future presidents in the modern presidency, we see the president after president are kind of like, look, Lincoln did it. And you're like, this is not the same thing. Stop using his example. So it is really frustrating that he did what you would say is correct, right? At the moment, in the time, all these kinds of things. And then that's being abused by future presidents for their own ends.
That's a great
Chris,
point.
I do think Lincoln, as you suggested, was very careful, or at least tried to be careful as to how he labeled or defined this conflict with the southern states, the seceding states. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and so it goes to your question, and Sarah addressed this as well, it goes to your question of whether these precedents that Lincoln set should have been applied to sort of foreign uses of force. I think you put your finger right on it. I do think there is a kind of distortion of the Lincoln record that was used by some 20th century presidents to justify some of their foreign endeavors. From the perspective of the Lincoln administration, I think I've got this right, this was an insurrection. And Lincoln, since he's charged under Article 2 with taking care that the laws be faithfully executed, was obligated to try to suppress this insurrection. The problem was, and I think this might be helpful for for the viewers, listeners, foreign governments are watching this as well. And Lincoln and his diplomatic corps and Secretary of State Seward had to be very careful about how they labeled their actions. And the British, for instance, were quick to seize on the blockade order as a sign that the United States government was recognizing the Confederacy as belligerents, as belligerent powers. And that has all sorts of international legal, to the extent that there was any sort of international order, ramifications at the time. So we're back to that question of defining war, defining the repression of a domestic uprising or domestic insurrection. Lincoln is walking a very, very fine line. But I will say, in contrast to some of his 20th century and 21st century successors, Lincoln is always very, very careful, very lawyerly. He's aware of the importance of language, and he is trying to set some boundaries, some limitations to these extraordinary exercises of power that he's engaged in.
Well, very thoughtful answers. That's very helpful to put really perspective on this, not only on Lincoln and what he was facing, but also, the legitimacy of using this this notion of war powers in the same way by future presidents. So again, I don't want to rush this conversation. This has been really great. We're down to 5-6 minutes here, and I know there are a number of questions about the war powers resolution. So again, we kind of touched on this earlier, but Casey, for example, wants to know about what the president's ignoring the war powers resolution. Can you maybe mention the extent to which the president and Congress still think that this has teeth? The president doesn't, Sarah? Oh no.
Yeah. So they, everyone, what they do is they say, consistent with the war powers resolution, I'm telling you, that I've bombed someplace, and pursuant to my powers as the executive and commander in chief, I get to do that. And so no president has ever, besides maybe Nixon, I guess, in his rebuttal, like no president has ever really said or made the claim clearly that this is an unconstitutional text and I refuse to adhere to it. But presidents will say in their signing statements and things like that, while I really appreciate Congress, passing an authorization for the use of force, right? So, both Bushes did this. While I really appreciate Congress passing these authorizations, I don't need them, right? I have all the power I need as the president, as commander in chief and chief executive, to do whatever I want. And so it's this sort of ambiguous, is it constitutional? Isn't it constitutional? The courts won't weigh in on this because it's a political question, right? It's really just, I always say that, the Supreme Court's kind of like the parents, and unless the the legislature or the executive draws blood, then they're not going to get involved, right? So like these kids are just bickering amongst themselves and they can just keep bickering.
Yeah, just to add to what Sarah said, every time there's been the use of force or putting American troops in situations where hostilities may break out, you usually get one or two or a handful of members of Congress who rush into the federal courts, trying to get the courts to intervene on this war powers question and on the constitutionality of the War Powers Act. And as Sarah mentioned, to this point, the courts have refused to get involved. And in my view, by the way, that's a healthy stance. I question over the long run whether the courts will continue to stay out of it. But so far, the courts have argued, look, the war powers debate, this invitation to struggle between the legislative and executive branch, that is a political question. It's a question reserved for the people's elected branches. And you guys need to step up to the plate and deal with this. And of course, members of Congress, as we've kind of touched on here and there, are often reluctant. They would just as soon like to kick this decision, kick the can down the road, have the courts step in and decide on the legality of the War Powers Act. So far, the courts haven't done it. Again, in my view, that's the correct stance. I would point out, and Sarah mentioned this, I believe every president since this thing is passed have refused to see themselves bound by it. They do get involved occasionally with cute language, as Sarah mentioned. They'll talk about consistent with the War Powers Act, but not pursuant to. In other words, it doesn't bind me. This thing is still on the books. It's been incredibly ineffectual. You might ask yourself why Congress keeps it on the books. The only thing I would say is perhaps it does cause the president maybe to look over his shoulder a little bit more in terms of putting forces into hostile situations. And perhaps it does apply some pressure to get these hostile situations over with as quickly as possible. Because once these things start to drag out and the American policy begins to fracture a bit over whether it's appropriate or not, the president begins to lose some steam and lose some support in Congress. So I think if you can make an argument for why it's still there, again, it perhaps applies some indirect pressure to the executive branch.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's very thoughtful. So, do you does the idea of congressional authorization of the use of force does that begin with the War Powers Resolution, or had that been something that was established before this? Do you know?
The Gulf of Tonkin was the first authorization of the use of force.
Okay.
And prior to that, we always had declared wars, but there were times when the president would go to Congress and say, listen, I've got this like thing I got to deal with. Can I get a little more money or a few more ships, something like that?
That's
so
probably what I was asking, Sarah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
It's exactly that like once we get into the Cold War, if you look at them, like I really encourage everyone to go and look at these documents. They're not very long. And you can see if you look at like the declaration of war with Japan, what a declaration looks like, right? It's who we're fighting, how we're doing it, what the president is authorized to do by Congress. Whereas all the authorizations from that point on are just kind of vague notions that we're going to do something somewhere using military force, and the president has expansive or increasingly expansive amounts of power to decide what that looks like, right? So it's not Congress authorizing the president, it's Congress saying, we're telling you, you can have whatever you want to deal with this problem, however you want to deal with it.
I see. Yeah, because sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Well, Congress does have tools at its disposal. We've hinted at this before. Politically speaking, again, it's difficult for them to do it, but they can cut off funding. They can conceivably, have articles of impeachment. I mean, there were part of the Nixon impeachment articles originally included the expansion of the American war from Vietnam into Cambodia without a declaration of war. Now, that didn't make it into the final bill, but so there are weapons that Congress could use. They refuse to use them, I think, mostly for the political reasons we've mentioned, which is that it's sort of radioactive to go after a commander-in-chief who's already put forces into a hostile situation. Nobody wants to be seen, even though perhaps they should, in their constitutional obligation would seem to require them. Politically speaking, nobody wants to be seen as the guy or woman undercutting the men and women in the field.
That's very interesting. And then the other thought that I had about this idea of authorizations, I mean, you both helped me understand this much more clearly, and I thank you for that. But Wyndham asked about Afghanistan and Iraq, right? I mean, those are wars. I mean, they seem to rise to that level of all the criteria that we were talking about earlier that could say this is really a full-scale war, but there was no declaration of war.
There was authorization to use force in September, October 2001. That thing is still in effect. There was a concerted effort recently by both Democrats and Republicans to either revise it or kill it. The withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan seems to have taken the wind out of that movement. But that would be a healthy development. You began to see some Democrats and some Republicans coalesce around the idea that a conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq that's now in its 20th year needs to be looked at by Congress. I think those men and women who are supporting that are right. But again, and even President Biden said that he would support an effort to either renew it or get rid of it.
Wow.
But I think what happened in the last couple of months has taken the wind out of their sails.
Yeah, in Afghanistan. I wonder though, too, if we'll ever see another declaration of war.
A great question, Chris.
Congress doesn't have to declare war now in light of this whole.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a bigger question. So, and we're down to our last minute, and I hesitate to do this with 1 minute left, and I'm not sure one of you recommended John Yoo.
I did, yeah.
Okay, Sarah, why?
Yeah.
Why John Yoo? I think I know the answer, but I'd like to.
The reason in part was so that we put Hamilton in dialogue with John Yoo's Hamilton, who's, I feel, one of the problems or interesting things about John Yoo is he is such a powerful arguer that you almost feel sort of gaslit when you're reading his things, because you think like, I don't see this version of the Constitution that you do, but you're compelling me so effectively towards your view of things that you can see how it is that like all of these different perspectives on the Constitution get kind of jumbled up in your head. And especially the fact that he was writing this, it was 2001. I mean, it was like, September 25th, 2001, right? So, as I said, like Hamilton takes a view of the presidency that's say this big, Madison takes a view of the presidency that's about this big. John Yoo's presidency, I mean, it's the fish, right, that you caught, and it's enormous, right? And so the size and scope of the president's power, the unilateralism of the president's power in John Yoo's hand is actively terrifying, right? And not only that, but like John Yoo, if you look at John Yoo's arguments, and you look at the Office of Legal Counsel in many, many administrations, Democrat and Republican, they're making John Yoo's arguments. So the lawyers for our presidents, when we're looking at what they're saying to justify all sorts of unilateral actions, they're doing exactly what John Yoo's doing. And you just want to pull your hair out because you're like, Alexander Hamilton didn't say these things in the way that you're suggesting. He said this again, like this is what presidential power is, not this. So it's a very, very interesting document, like I said, in dialogue with actual Alexander Hamilton, especially in the hands of such a powerful arguer like John Yoo.
I would just add that John Yoo is basically Alexander Hamilton on steroids. I have expressed my admiration for Hamilton. I've written a book defending some of George W. Bush's actions in the, there we go.
Yeah, I was just reading this the other day.
But also George W. Bush's actions in the war on terror. But look, even I find some of Yoo's arguments, and I'm a good Hamiltonian, I find them excessive. Let me just say one final thing, building on what Sarah said, and I know we're out of time here, Chris. You go back to Nicholas Katzenbach, who was an attorney general under Lyndon Johnson. Katzenbach tried to argue that Lyndon Johnson didn't really need Congress to conduct the war in Vietnam. George H.W. Bush suggested at one point prior to the first Gulf War and the pushing the Iraqis out of Kuwait that he didn't need Congress to use force. And then, of course, George W. Bush, sadly, I think, and I've defended Bush on other fronts, he should have asked for a declaration of war against the government of Afghanistan that was sheltering and providing comfort to the people that conducted 9/11. That was a missed opportunity. I don't even see any indication that the Bush administration seriously thought about a declaration of war or that members of Congress were pressuring them to seek it. That was a missed opportunity. And it does lead me to think that the power to declare war is perhaps dead and gone, sadly.
Sadly. Well, I hate to end on a sad note.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, but by the way, you mentioned one other thing I think it's worth mentioning. Brought up another point, is that I believe all of the declarations of war that Congress have issued have come at the request of the president.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, which I just mentioned in passing. That's a very interesting thing. Now,
Yeah.
I'm sure usually before presidents ask for declarations of war, they've been talking with members of Congress and they kind of know what the vote's going to be. So
Yeah.
I don't think a president has ever asked for a declaration of war and not received it.
Not that I'm aware of.
Anyway, it's maybe we'll end on that as an interesting
Yeah.
question for people joining us to think about moving forward, because again, shows this intricate relationship of Congress
Yeah.
and president when it comes to these things.
There was some difficulty, I think, with Madison in 1812 because there was
Yes.
a big, strong opposition. But I think that's probably as close as it was a nail biter, right? In terms of him
Good
getting
point,
the
Sarah.
pass. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think McKinley he got his declaration of war from Congress, but not on the same grounds that he wanted it. Interesting.
Yeah.
So there was a little pushback, I think, when it came.
There was also significant pushback on Polk's war against Mexico. So, yeah.
Okay. Hey, thank you both so much. This has just been really enlightening, and I appreciate your time. And always a pleasure to see you both. And I wish you both the best. And hopefully we can do this again. So,
Great.
thank
Thanks.
you again.
Thanks, Chris.
And take a look at the books that we've mentioned earlier. Maybe we could.
He has like
post
6
those somewhere.
others too, so he's
Just anything by either of these great thinkers is worth reading. So, and maybe we'll be able to post those somewhere for if you want to look them up. Again, thanks everybody for joining us. Great questions today. Just a reminder again about the email that you will receive with your link for a certificate of participation. If you've enjoyed our conversation today, look into the other resources that tah.org provides. Again, our documents in detail webinars are on Wednesday evenings. Our in-person seminars are back, so check the website for opportunities to get together in person and have conversations like this with very thoughtful scholars. And if you get a chance, help us spread the word about our resources on social media. And your colleagues, every little bit helps. So our next webinar will be Saturday, November 6th, and we'll be discussing the presidency and the Supreme Court. Hope to see you all then. Until then, take care.
Thanks again for listening. Our next Saturday webinar in our American Presidency series will take place on Saturday, November 6th of 2021, and will focus on the relationship between the presidency and the United States Supreme Court. Again, you can learn more and register for this program at tah.org.